The desert trembled with the sound of engines. A low metallic growl rolled across the olive groves of Tunisia, mingling with the wind and the smell of diesel and dust. For hours, the men had heard them coming. The German Panzers, the giants of iron and arrogance. Private William Nash pressed his cheek into the dirt, sweat streaking down his face. He was 19, barely trained, and holding a weapon he didn't trust. A 6-foot steel tube painted green, wired together like something from a farmer's shed. The men called it the stovepipe. It was supposed to stop tanks. No one knew if it actually could. Nash's loader, Anthony DeSanto from Brooklyn, slid a rocket into the back of the launcher, his hands trembling. The metal hissed as it met the hot air. The smell of oil and cordite filled their nostrils. They had one chance. Across the field, a German Panzer rolled forward, its tracks grinding through the earth, its turret sweeping left and right like the gaze of a predator. Sunlight gleamed on its armor. The men inside were confident, unhurried. They had faced every weapon the Allies had thrown at them. Nothing had stopped them yet. Nash took a breath. 50 yards, 40, 35. DeSanto whispered, "Now." A flash, a hiss, a streak of white smoke tore across the field. Then, a burst of fire. The rocket struck the Panzer's side plate. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the tank shuddered, halted, and erupted from within. A column of smoke, and flame shot from its hatches. The crew screamed as they clawed their way out, one of them falling, clothes ablaze. The invincible machine was dead. The men stared in disbelief. Then, laughter, shouting, the raw sound of hope bursting through. Fear. The stovepipe had worked. But triumph is brief in war. A second Panzer's gun barked, and the world exploded in dust and heat. When the smoke cleared, one of them was gone. The other crawled away, dragging the shattered tube behind him. The desert wind carried the smell of burning oil and flesh. And somewhere in that chaos, a legend was born. The bazooka. A weapon the Germans mocked. A weapon America barely understood. A weapon that turned fear into defiance. Before the bazooka became a symbol of courage, it was a punchline. To the Germans, it looked ridiculous. A plumber's pipe, painted green, carried by amateurs. They had built their empire on machines of precision, armor that clattered across continents. Their tanks were instruments of terror, and the mere sight of them had shattered armies. To imagine that a foot soldier could stop one, with a toy rocket no less, was laughable. In late 1942, America was still young in the war. Its soldiers were untested, its command inexperienced, and its weapons rushed from factory floors to the front line. When Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, began, it marked the United States' first real step into the inferno of the Second World War. General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the operation. Calm, intelligent, burdened by responsibility, he faced a cruel truth on the eve of the landings. Most of the young men under his command had never fired the bazooka, the very weapon they were supposed to rely on against tanks. He sat in a dimly lit tent, papers scattered before him, the air thick with cigarette smoke and exhaustion. Reports from the ships were grim. No live fire training, no confidence in the weapon. "We're asking boys to fight tanks with a weapon they don't even know," he murmured. The room was silent. Outside, the wind howled through the canvas, a sound like the breath of the coming storm. For the soldiers, that storm was closer than they knew. As the invasion fleet neared the Algerian coast, the men stared at the strange weapons stacked beside their packs. 6 feet of steel tube, a clumsy battery trigger, rockets packed in grease and straw. It looked like madness. Some laughed nervously. Others said nothing at all. A few tried to read the brief instructions printed on scraps of paper. Load the rocket, line up the sights, fire. That was it. No one explained what happened next. When the landings began at dawn, chaos swallowed everything. Gunfire cracked from the cliffs. Mortars burst in the surf. Men stumbled through the waves, rifles soaked, hearts pounding. The bazookas, heavy, awkward, banged against helmets and tangled in straps. Some soldiers dropped them entirely. Others fired blindly, praying they wouldn't explode in their hands. For many, it seemed the Germans were right. The stovepipe was a joke. Misfires sent rockets spinning into ditches or fizzling out in the sand. Smoke trails revealed their positions, drawing machine gun fire that tore through the beaches. Those first hours were a nightmare of confusion, and the men's faith in the weapon and in themselves began to crumble. But among the chaos, a few refused to surrender to despair. In the dry gullies and narrow wadis of Tunisia, they knelt, behind low stone walls, learning by instinct what training had not taught them. 2 men, 1 loads, 1 aims. Wait until the tank is close enough that you can see the bolts on its armor. Then fire and pray. At first, the results were scattered. A rocket that hit too low, another that missed completely. And then, one that struck true. The explosion tore through a Panzer's side armor, sending its crew fleeing in smoke and terror. The men watching felt something change inside them. Hope. For the first time, they had a weapon that could make giants bleed. Word spread quickly. Around campfires, whispers became legend. Jones's squad got one. They hit a Panzer dead. Horn 2. It worked. Each story lit a spark of courage in soldiers who only days earlier had felt powerless beneath the roar of German armor. Still, the cost was high. For every tank stopped, another 3 rolled forward. For every team that fired, 1 was lost to return fire or a rocket that failed. The bazooka was no miracle. It was a coin flip, a gamble in smoke and steel. But it gave the infantry something they'd never had before, the power to fight back. The Germans didn't understand it yet. They still mocked, still dismissed the weapon as luck or rumor. But on the battlefield, something irreversible had begun. The age of the tank's untouchable supremacy was ending. Not by another tank, not by artillery, but by a boy with a steel tube and enough nerve to stand his ground. In the deserts of North Africa, courage was often a matter of seconds. The seconds between fear and fire. And the bazooka, crude and imperfect as it was, gave those seconds meaning, because war is not always won by perfection. Sometimes it is won by persistence, by a handful of soldiers who refuse to believe that a joke cannot become a weapon, and that mockery cannot turn into fear. Every weapon has a story, and the bazookas began not in a grand laboratory or a military arsenal, but in the cramped workshop of an engineer who refused to give up on an idea. In the spring of 1942, as the United States scrambled to prepare for a global war it had barely entered, the army faced a sobering truth. Its infantry had no reliable way to stop tanks. The Germans had proven what their armor could do. From the fields of France to the deserts of Libya, Panzers had crushed everything in their path. Britain had its cumbersome Boys anti-tank rifle, France its small-caliber guns, but for the average American soldier, armed with little more than a rifle and courage, a tank was death rolling on treads. Explosives could stop them, yes. Grenades, satchel charges, but only if a man got close enough to die with his target. The US Army needed something new, something small, portable, and deadly. The answer came from Colonel Leslie Skinner, a quiet ordnance engineer, and Lieutenant Edward Oule, a young officer with a knack for improvisation. Skinner had been working with a new explosive, a shaped charge, warhead designed to melt through armor by focusing its blast into a narrow, burning jet. It was effective, but there was one problem. It was too heavy to throw. That's when Oule had an idea. If a man couldn't throw the weapon, perhaps he could fire it. He found a length of scrap steel tubing about 6 feet long and rigged it with a simple electrical trigger powered by dry cell batteries, the kind used in flashlights. It looked absurd, but when they fitted the warhead into the tube and touched the wires together, the rocket leapt forward in a plume of smoke. The crude prototype worked. Barely, but it worked. The Army brass was skeptical. When Oule and Skinner presented their invention to the Ordnance Board, officers laughed openly. It looked like something cobbled together in a garage. A plumber's dream, one colonel called it. But when the shaped charge blew a hole clean through a captured tank during testing, the laughter stopped. The weapon was christened the M1 rocket launcher. But to the soldiers who first saw it, it looked and sounded like a novelty instrument, a bazooka after a comedic horn played by radio performer Bob Burns. The nickname stuck, and history's most unassuming tank killer found its identity in a joke. By the summer of 1942, America was racing against time. Factories were working around the clock. Every week brought new reports from Europe. of Axis victories, of Allied losses. The United States was still learning how to fight a modern war, and so the bazooka, still barely tested, was rushed into production. There were problems, endless ones. The wiring shorted in damp weather, the rockets misfired, the backblast scorched the ground and revealed the shooter's position. But the war would not wait for perfection. The order came down: send them to North Africa. When Eisenhower reviewed the plan for Operation Torch, the bazooka was listed as a promising infantry support weapon. In truth, it was a gamble, a desperate one. The generals knew it, the engineers knew it, and Eisenhower knew it most of all. He had seen the reports, photos of Panzers rolling over Europe, their armor shrugging off artillery and gunfire. He knew that once the landings began, his men would be face to face with the same steel monsters. Without the bazooka, they'd have no chance. With it, maybe they would. Better a weapon they don't know, he said quietly, than no weapon at all. On the ships steaming toward Algeria, the crates of bazookas were stacked like coffins. New paint, fresh oil, wires still stiff from the factory. The men opened them with curiosity, some with fear. They had been told it was powerful, but not how to use it. There had been no time for drills, no firing range, no instructor shouting corrections. Private Henry Collins from Ohio remembered the first time he touched one. The sergeant tossed it to him and said, "You and Miller, this is your stovepipe, figure it out." Collins looked at his buddy and muttered, "We're supposed to stop tanks with this." And yet, in that single act of uncertainty, a new kind of warfare was being born. Not through confidence, but through necessity. When the invasion began, most of the men carrying bazookas had never fired them before. Some misassembled the launchers, some forgot to attach the battery. A few discovered too late what happened if someone stood behind the tube when it fired. But every battle teaches its own brutal lessons, and those who survived learned quickly. They learned to wait for the tank to expose its flank. They learned to use the terrain, gullies, ruins, olive groves, as cover. They learned that courage meant standing still when every instinct told you to run. As reports reached Eisenhower's headquarters, some triumphant, most tragic, he saw the truth of his gamble unfold. For every soldier burned by misfire, another had stopped a tank dead in its tracks. For every crate of faulty rockets, another brought salvation to a pinned-down squad. The weapon was working, imperfectly, dangerously, unpredictably. But it was working. Eisenhower called it a lesson paid in blood. But he also saw something else in those reports, the beginnings of belief. His men were starting to trust the stovepipe. They were adapting, innovating, fighting back. War had forced the Americans to learn faster than they were ready. And in that fire, a new kind of army was being forged. One that relied not just on industry or technology, but on the courage of the ordinary soldier and the stubborn will to keep fighting with whatever he had. In the months ahead, the bazooka would prove itself in the only way that mattered, not in laboratories, not in speeches, but in battle. And in that crucible, Eisenhower's gamble would become a legend, because sometimes history turns not on the brilliance of strategy or the strength of machines, but on a handful of men, frightened, untested, carrying a piece of scrap metal, who refuse to fail. War is the most merciless teacher. It gives its lessons in fear, and it demands payment in blood. By December 1942, the Americans in North Africa were learning fast and painfully. They were fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps, veterans who had spent years perfecting desert warfare. The Americans, by contrast, were new to everything: the heat, the dust, the endless horizon that gave no shelter and no mercy. The bazooka, the weapon meant to level the playing field, had now reached its true test. No more firing ranges, no demonstrations, no theoretical armor penetration charts, just men, machines, and the brutal truth of combat. In those early weeks, success was as rare as rain in the desert. Some soldiers fired their rockets too soon and watched them glance off the thick armor. Others waited too long and were torn apart by machine gun fire before they could pull the trigger. Rockets jammed, wiring failed, batteries died in the heat. And yet, slowly, stubbornly, the stovepipe began to earn its reputation. In the wadis and olive groves near the town of Taburba, a small squad of American infantry was pinned down by a Panzer patrol. The tanks rumbled through the farmland, the sound of their treads shaking the ground. The Americans huddled in a shallow ditch, 10 men, exhausted, afraid, and out of options. Two of them, Private William Nash and his loader Anthony DeSanto, still had their bazooka. They had never used it in battle. They barely knew how. But they knew one thing. If the tanks reached them, they were dead. DeSanto slid the rocket into the tube. His hands were slick with sweat. He whispered, "Ready." Nash nodded, lifted the weapon, and peered over the rim of the ditch. The tank was closing fast, so close he could see the commander's goggles reflecting sunlight. He waited until the Panzer was broadside. Then he squeezed the trigger. The rocket hissed through the air and struck the tank square in the side. There was a flash, then a dull, contained boom. Smoke poured from the hatch. The Panzer lurched, stalled, and stopped. Its engine coughed. Once, then died. Inside, chaos reigned. The crew tried to escape, one screaming, another limp, as black smoke curled skyward. To the watching Americans, it was as if the earth itself had shifted. The unstoppable had been stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone shouted, "It worked!" Laughter broke through the gunfire. Men clapped each other's shoulders. In the middle of hell there was hope, but victory in war never comes without cost. A second Panzer rolled into view, its turret swinging toward them. The air turned to thunder. A shell landed where the bazooka team had been seconds earlier. Dirt and smoke filled the air. When it cleared, one man was gone. The other lay half buried in dust, his ears ringing, his weapon twisted and broken. Still, the first kill had been made. And that single act, that brief burst of courage, would echo across the desert. That night, around campfires and in whispered rumors, the story spread. 2 men had stopped a Panzer. The stovepipe wasn't a joke. It worked. The soldiers who heard, those words didn't need proof. They needed belief. And the bazooka gave them that. In the following days, more and more teams took up the weapon. They learned the little tricks. Hide your position until the tank turns. Aim low, hit the side. Never stay in the same spot after firing. For every team that succeeded, another was lost. The smoke trail from the rocket was a death sentence, a white line that led directly back to the shooter. Once you fired, you had seconds to live before the return fire found you. And still, they fired. Because for the first time, American infantrymen could make the giants bleed. By early 1943, the Germans had begun to take notice. Reports filtered back to Berlin. Strange new rockets destroying tanks in Tunisia, crews abandoning their vehicles in panic. At first, officers dismissed them as exaggerations, but the stories kept coming. A Panzer hit in the flank and burned. Another crippled on a farm road, its armor pierced like paper. Something was changing. For the German tank crews who once felt invincible, fear crept in. They began to see ghosts in the dust, hidden shapes in ditches, flashes of smoke in the distance. The laughter was gone. The word bazooka began to circulate among the men of the Africa Corps, spoken not with mockery, but with caution. And yet, the price for every German tank destroyed was steep. Bazooka teams lived short lives. They fought from gullies, ruins, and alleyways, often alone, often hunted. The average life expectancy of a gunner after firing was less than a minute. Many never got a second shot. Still, they volunteered. Because the stovepipe, for all its flaws, gave them something they had lacked before, the power to stand their ground. The desert campaign dragged on, brutal and unforgiving. The sun beat down, supplies ran thin. Fear became a constant companion. But with every battle, the Americans grew harder, wiser and more dangerous. The bazooka had proven itself not by perfection, but by perseverance. It had turned raw recruits into soldiers, despair into defiance, and as word of its success reached headquarters, Eisenhower knew that his gamble, reckless, desperate, born of necessity, had paid off. His men now believed in the weapon. And belief in war is a weapon all its own. But North Africa was far from over. Ahead lay the true test, a battle that would shatter illusions, expose weakness, and baptize an army in chaos. The name of that battle was Kasserine Pass. Every army faces a moment when courage alone is not enough, when experience, organization, and sheer will are tested to breaking point. For the young Americans in North Africa, that moment came in February 1943, in a narrow valley called Kasserine Pass. It was a place of dust and stone where the desert met the mountains. To the eye it seemed harmless, gentle ridges, dry gullies, olive trees twisted by the wind. But beneath that quiet surface lay the stage for the US Army's harshest lesson of the war. The German commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, saw opportunity. He knew the Americans were green, brave, yes, but disorganized, uncertain. He intended to teach them a lesson they would never forget. His armored columns moved like thunder, Panzers, half-tracks, artillery, all rolling through the passes with the precision of a machine. Veteran soldiers of the Afrika Korps, tanned and battle-hardened, advanced behind the roar of engines. They had crushed British and French forces before. They expected the same now. For the Americans waiting in the valley, it began with sound, the distant clank of treads, the rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. And then, the shriek of incoming shells. The first barrage hit before dawn. Men scrambled from foxholes, blinded by dust, deafened by explosions. Radios crackled with confusion. Orders contradicted each other. Some units fell back. Others stood their ground and died where they fought. Amid the chaos, the Bazooka teams, two-man crews scattered across the valley, tried to hold the line. Their job was simple in theory: stop the tanks. In practice, it was suicide. Sergeant Robert Kelly and his loader, Private Lewis Carter, crouched in a ditch beside a winding track. They could see the first Panzer column approaching, its lead tank cresting a ridge, sunlight flashing off its gun barrel. Kelly's hands shook as he steadied the tube. "Load it!" he hissed. Carter shoved a rocket into place, his breath ragged. The tank was close now, so close they could hear the engine straining, smell the exhaust. Kelly aimed low, just behind the treads, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket streaked out in a trail of smoke. It struck the Panzer's side. A flash, then a burst of flame. The tank shuddered and stopped. The commander tumbled out, shouting. Behind him, the column halted in confusion. For a moment, it seemed the Americans might hold. Then the second tank opened fire. The explosion threw Kelly and Carter backward. Dirt rained down. The air turned white with smoke and dust. Carter shouted something. Kelly couldn't hear it. When his vision cleared, the Panzer's turret was turning toward them. "Move!" Carter screamed. They dove out of the ditch as the machine gun raked the earth they'd just vacated. The Bazooka lay shattered in the dirt. Kelly never saw Carter again. Scenes like that unfolded across the valley. Some Bazooka teams struck lucky, halting entire tank columns. Others never got the chance to fire. Many rockets misfired, exploding prematurely or veering off course. But for every failure, there was one desperate act of defiance, one crew that refused to retreat. A corporal named James Riley later wrote, "We weren't fighting for ground anymore. We were fighting not to be overrun." His squad, cornered, near a narrow road, destroyed the lead tank with a single shot, forcing the rest of the column to reverse under fire. They bought 10 minutes that saved 100 lives. Kasserine Pass was not a battle, it was a reckoning. The Germans moved like professionals. Their tanks advanced in disciplined waves, their artillery precise and merciless. The Americans were caught between courage and chaos. Entire units broke apart. Trucks were abandoned, supplies burned. The air was filled with dust and panic. When the smoke cleared 2 days later, the ground was littered with wreckage, twisted vehicles, shattered guns, and the bodies of men who had learned what war truly meant. Nearly 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a defeat so complete that even Eisenhower, far from the front, was shaken. But in the midst of that humiliation lay something crucial, something that would outlast defeat. The Bazooka had proven its worth. Reports from the front told of isolated teams that had held crossroads, stalled armored advances, and fought until their rockets were gone. They had not turned the tide, but they had shown that courage and ingenuity could hold back steel if only for a moment. Rommel himself, ever the professional, took notice. He admitted privately that the Americans, though untrained, were learning fast. Their weapons are crude, he said, but their courage is real. After Kasserine, Eisenhower made sweeping changes. Commanders were replaced, training was intensified, tactics were rewritten. In the deserts of Algeria, under the pitiless sun, American soldiers began to drill relentlessly. Bazooka crews practiced loading and firing until the motion became instinct. One man loading, one aiming, firing, moving, firing again. They learned to coordinate with riflemen, to use terrain, to think like tankers. The weapon that had once been a gamble now became doctrine. It was no longer the stovepipe. It was the shield of the infantry, their only defense against the iron beasts that haunted their nightmares. Private Henry Collins, who had once whispered that the bazooka was a toy, wrote home months later. "It's not a joke anymore. We know what it can do now. When we hear the tanks, we don't run. We set up, we fight." That was the difference. The fear was still there. It never left. But now it was joined by something else. Resolve. The B. Defeat at Kasserine Pass marked the end of innocence for the US Army. The men who survived it were no longer recruits. They were soldiers, shaped by failure, hardened by loss and ready to strike back. And when they did, the bazooka would be at the heart of it. Because in every battle that followed, from the hills of Sicily to the hedgerows of Normandy, the lessons of Kasserine would echo. A soldier's courage is not in the weapon he carries, it's in his willingness to use it, even when all hope seems lost. In war, imitation is not flattery, it is survival. When the first captured bazookas reached German hands in early 1943, they caused more confusion than awe. The weapon looked primitive, a long tube of steel, a crude electrical trigger powered by flashlight batteries, wires taped together like a school experiment. To the engineers of the Wehrmacht, men raised on the gospel of precision, it seemed absurd that such a thing could threaten their Panzers. But the battlefield reports could not be ignored. Something was happening in North Africa. Tanks that had once advanced without hesitation were now being stopped, crippled, or burned alive by infantry, carrying these awkward American rocket tubes. The Germans, who had built their reputation on the strength of their machines, were suddenly confronted by the power of simplicity. In Berlin, captured bazookas were disassembled piece by piece on long metal tables. The engineers shook their heads at the lack of polish, the unrefined construction, the rough welds, the cheap wiring. But when they studied the shaped charge warhead, their expressions changed. One officer, in a memo to the Ordnance Department, wrote, "It is crude, but it is clever." The warhead, small, efficient, and devastating, was the heart of the weapon. It didn't rely on speed or impact. It focused its explosive force into a single molten jet, cutting through armor as if it were paper. It was science distilled into simplicity. And it terrified the Germans because they had nothing like it. Within weeks, the order came down. Copy it, improve it, deploy it. The result would be the Raketen Panzerbüchse 54, known to Allied soldiers by a name that would haunt them. The Panzerschreck, the tank's terror. It was in essence a supersized bazooka. The German engineers enlarged the tube, redesigned the firing mechanism, and increased the caliber from 60 millimeters to 88. The same diameter as their most feared anti-tank gun. When fired, its rocket could punch through more than 200 millimeters of armor, enough to destroy even the heaviest Allied tanks. The first prototypes were clumsy and dangerous. The backblast was so fierce it burned the operator's face. Crews improvised by attaching a sheet of steel behind the launcher, forming a protective shield. It made the weapon heavier, bulkier, but it worked. By late 1943, Panzerschreck teams were appearing on every front, from the snows of the Eastern Front to the hedgerows of France. The Germans had turned Mockery into menace, and yet there was a kind of poetic irony in it. The Wehrmacht, the most disciplined and technologically advanced army in Europe, had been forced to copy a weapon born from American improvisation, a weapon cobbled together by two men using scrap tubing and dry cell batteries. The toy had come full circle. On the front lines, German tank crews felt the change. Before, they had driven boldly into villages and across open fields. confident that their armor made them invincible. Now they advanced with caution. They sent infantry ahead to sweep hedgerows and ruins, terrified of hidden bazooka teams. Tank commanders who once mocked the stovepipe now muttered warnings to their men. Watch the gullies. Watch the walls. The Americans have rockets now. For American soldiers, hearing that the Germans had copied their weapon was both unsettling and strangely satisfying. If the Krauts are building their own, one GI said, then I guess we did something right. But satisfaction came with a price. The bazooka had started an arms race it could not control. The Panzerschreck was bigger, deadlier, and soon everywhere. When Allied tanks rolled through Italy and into France, they faced German infantry carrying the weapon their own army had invented. Bazooka teams that once held the upper hand now found themselves hunted by their own creation's darker twin. It was a grim reminder that innovation once unleashed answers to no flag. Still, the bazooka remained a vital part of the American arsenal. Its simplicity was its strength. Easy to produce, easy to carry, and effective at close range. No matter how advanced the enemy's copy became, the original still had its place. By the time of the Italian campaign in late 1943, soldiers had learned to use it not just against tanks, but against machine gun nests and fortified bunkers. A single rocket could collapse a stone wall or silence a nest of defenders. The weapon had evolved beyond its original purpose. It had become the infantryman's equalizer. The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, had learned a harsh truth. Sometimes genius lies not in perfection, but in pragmatism. War rewards. What works, not what impresses. And what worked was a crude American stovepipe. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the Desert War ended and a new phase began. The Allies prepared to invade Europe, to strike at Hitler's fortress from the west. And as they trained for the battles to come, the bazooka was no longer a curiosity or a gamble. It was doctrine. It was essential. Every platoon had its teams. Every man knew how to use it. The weapon that had begun as an afterthought was now woven into the fabric of Allied warfare, a symbol of how quickly necessity can become mastery. And across the front, the Germans watched, wary and silent. The laughter that had greeted the stovepipe a year before had been replaced by something far heavier: respect, and perhaps fear, because they had learned what Eisenhower already knew. In modern war, courage armed with ingenuity can outmatch even the most polished machine. The bazooka was no longer just a weapon. It was an idea, and ideas, once loosed upon the battlefield, cannot be contained. History remembers machines, tanks, bombers, ships, the vast engines of war that define eras. But it is built piece by piece by the hands of ordinary men, and sometimes by the simplest of tools. When the guns fell silent in North Africa, in the spring of 1943, the desert was littered with wreckage, burned-out Panzers, shattered trucks, crumpled helmets half buried in sand. Among them lay the broken tubes of dozens of bazookas, bent, scorched, useless. To the casual eye, they were scraps, but to the men who had carried them, they were relics, symbols of survival and stubborn hope. The Americans who had stumbled ashore months earlier as green recruits were no longer the same men. They had faced defeat, fear and death, and learned faster than anyone had thought possible. The bazooka had been their teacher as much as their weapon. It had taught them how to stand firm when steel rolled toward them. It had shown them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to fight despite it. In the months after the campaign, as the Allies prepared for Sicily, Italy and beyond, the lessons of Tunisia were written into doctrine. Every platoon now had its bazooka team. Every training ground echoed with the hiss and thump of rockets, and every young soldier learned what veterans already knew: that war was not won by strength alone, but by will. Eisenhower, who had once doubted the stovepipe, now listed it beside the Jeep and the C-47 transport plane as one of the weapons that gave the US Army its backbone. He understood that its importance was not measured in steel or statistics, but in morale. A $25 tube, carried by a 19-year-old private, could hold back a tank worth thousands, and in that equation lay the true genius of the weapon. The Germans understood it too. Their imitation, the Panzers, became infamous. It was heavier, deadlier, more refined, but it was born out of respect. Even the enemy's engineers had to admit that the Americans' crude invention had changed the nature of warfare. It was a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes innovation comes not from laboratories or grand design, but from desperation, from the hands of soldiers who refused to accept defeat. By 1944, when Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the bazooka was no longer a novelty. It was part of the rhythm of war, carried through hedgerows across rivers, into villages torn apart by artillery. It destroyed bunkers, shattered walls, silenced machine guns. It gave the infantry a weapon they could believe in. And belief is a force no army can measure. The German tank crews who had once laughed at the stovepipe no longer mocked it. They had seen too many of their comrades crawl from burning armor, too many columns stopped cold by a single flash of fire. Respect in war is born in blood, and the bazooka had earned it. But for the men who used it, respect came with a cost. Every bazooka gunner carried a sentence on his shoulders. The weapon made him powerful, and it made him a target. Machine gunners searched for him first. Snipers waited for the glint of the tube in the sun. Many teams didn't survive more than a few battles. Loaders knew that when the gunner fell, they would inherit the weapon and the odds that came with it. And still, they volunteered, because to carry the bazooka was to carry responsibility for the squad, for the fight, for the fragile thread between life and annihilation. One officer later wrote, "We didn't worship the weapon, we respected the men who had the courage to fire it." That sentiment became the bazooka's true legacy. It was not the engineering that mattered, it was the men behind it. They were mechanics, farm boys, clerks, students, ordinary Americans who found themselves staring down machines that symbolized everything terrifying about modern war. And yet, they stood, they aimed, they fought. Each rocket that struck home carried more than explosive power. It carried defiance, a message that no enemy, no matter how strong, was beyond reach. By the war's end, the bazooka had earned its place beside the Sherman, the Jeep, and the Thompson in the pantheon of Allied icons, not because it was flawless, far from it. It was temperamental, dangerous, and crude. But it worked when it mattered, and that made all the difference. Historians later called it a soldier's weapon, one that represented the American spirit in its purest form, improvised, imperfect, but determined. Its legacy continued long after the war, inspiring designs from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. Even modern anti-tank weapons still trace their ancestry to that simple tube of steel first tested in the sands of Tunisia. But perhaps the greatest impact of the bazooka was not technological but emotional. It changed how soldiers thought about themselves. It gave the infantryman, the most vulnerable figure on the battlefield, the means to fight back against the machines of war. It turned fear into action. It turned helplessness into resolve. Private De Santo, whose letter home had once called himself a walking coffin, survived the war. Years later, in an interview, he was asked what he remembered most. He didn't mention the tanks or the explosions. He said quietly, the sound of the rocket leaving the tube. It wasn't just noise, it was the sound of hope. That sentence captures everything the bazooka came to mean. Hope, in the hands of the terrified, the inexperienced, the ordinary. Hope, fired in desperation, streaking across a battlefield toward a machine built to dominate men. Hope, exploding against armor, proving that even giants can fall. From the olive groves of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, that lesson endured. That courage, ingenuity, and unity, even in their rawest, most improvised form, could change. The outcome of battles and the course of history. The Germans stopped laughing. The Americans stopped doubting. And the bazooka, once dismissed as a toy, became a legend, a weapon that carried not just firepower, but faith. Its story, like the men who wielded it, is a reminder of something timeless, that history is not shaped only by generals and great machines, but by those who refuse to yield, who stand shoulder to shoulder against the impossible. When the young soldiers of North Africa faced their first tanks, they did not know if the stovepipe in their hands would work. Many did not live to find out. But their courage, their refusal to run, lit a spark that burned across continents. And that spark still burns today, because the lesson of the bazooka reaches beyond the battlefield. It speaks to every challenge, every fear that seems too large to overcome. It reminds us that even when the odds are overwhelming, when the enemy seems invincible, courage, ingenuity, and faith can tip the balance. The bazooka was not perfect, but it was enough. And sometimes, in war and in life, enough is all you need to change the world. Every war creates its own kind of brotherhood. In the deserts of North Africa, the mud of Italy and the hedgerows of France, one of the strangest and most dangerous bonds was between two men, the gunner and the loader of a bazooka team. They carried the same weapon, they shared the same fear, and more often than not they shared the same death. To the rest of the squad, the bazooka crew were both a source of pride and pity. Pride because they carried the weapon that could stop a tank. Pity because everyone knew what that meant. When the tanks came, they would be the first to fire and the first to die. Each team was a study in contrasts. One man aimed, the other loaded. One carried the tube, the other the rockets. Heavy, volatile, unpredictable. Their survival depended on perfect rhythm, perfect timing, and unspoken trust. Private Henry Collins, who had once doubted the stovepipe, wrote home months later, "It's not a toy anymore. We know what it can do now. When we hear the tanks, we don't run. We set up, we wait, and we fight." For Collins and thousands like him, that was not bravado, it was evolution. They had learned through fire what training had not taught them. Each rocket fired was a gamble. Each shot a heartbeat between courage and annihilation. In the chaos of battle, the two-man dance became instinct. The loader crouched behind the gunner, sliding the rocket into place, shouting, "Ready!" before dropping flat as the trigger was pulled. The roar of the backblast, the hiss of the rocket, the acrid sting of smoke. These became the rhythm of their lives. They learned to move fast, to fire and relocate before the enemy could zero in. They learned to fight without seeing, trusting that their partner had their back. And when one fell, the other often followed, not out of recklessness, but out of loyalty. No one left their gunner behind. One soldier later said, "We fired as one man. We feared as one man, and when it came, we fell as one. The danger was constant. Once a rocket was fired, the white smoke trail betrayed their position instantly. German machine gunners were trained to follow that ghostly line through the air and rake the origin with fire. Snipers learned to look for the silhouette of the long tube, the unmistakable shape that meant danger. To carry a bazooka was to carry a target. In the villages of Tunisia and the mountains of Italy, it was the same story again and again. Bazooka teams crouched in gullies, behind walls, in the ruins of farmhouses waiting. When the tanks appeared, the world seemed to shrink to a single breath, a single heartbeat. Private Anthony DeSanto, the Brooklyn loader who had fought at Taburba, once called it the longest second in the world. He said, "You hear them before you see them. You smell them before you fire. And when you pull that trigger, you're either a hero or a corpse." Those words became the silent creed of the bazooka men. Not courage without fear, but courage despite fear. As months passed, the teams grew sharper, faster, deadlier. They became symbols of resilience in the American army, proof that ordinary soldiers could face extraordinary odds and prevail. But their confidence carried a shadow. They knew what their duty meant. When a tank column appeared on the horizon, every man in the platoon instinctively looked to the bazooka team. "Set up the pipe," someone would shout, and the two men would exchange a glance, a mix of fear and grim acceptance, before moving forward. It was an unspoken contract between them and their brothers. They would hold the line even if it killed them. For many it did. Loaders often joked that their job title really meant next gunner. The attrition was brutal. A team could last a few days, a week if lucky, sometimes less. But even knowing that, replacements kept volunteering. Private Raymond Ellis wrote in his diary before the Sicilian invasion, "They say we're walking coffins. Maybe so, but I'd rather carry a coffin that can shoot than hide behind a rifle that can't." That, grim humor born of desperation, kept men sane. It was easier to laugh at death than to think about it. By 1943, the bazooka had become more than a weapon. It was a psychological lifeline. It gave the infantry something precious, the sense that they were not helpless, that they could fight back, that they mattered. And in war, that belief can mean the difference between collapse and courage. Even commanders began to recognize the emotional impact of the weapon. Reports from the front spoke not just of tactical success, but of morale, how soldiers fought harder when a bazooka team was nearby. A single tube of steel could hold an entire line together. By the spring of 1943, the laughter that once surrounded the stovepipe had vanished completely. German tank crews now approached battlefields with caution, sending infantry ahead to sweep, for ambushes. Some bolted extra plates to their tanks in vain attempts to blunt the shaped charge. The myth of invincibility had been shattered, and it was shattered by 2 men and a tube. In the camps between battles, the bazooka men became legends in their own right. Around mess tables and campfires, they told stories, near misses, lucky hits, the time a rocket punched clean through a Panzer and set the horizon on fire. Each story was half boast, half confession, a way to laugh at the fear that still lived in their bones. Don't aim at the front plate, one would say. Go for the treads, hit them low and mean. Another would grin and add, fire one, then move, if you stay, you're dead. These scraps of battlefield wisdom, passed from one trembling pair of hands to the next, became gospel. No manual, no officer, no classroom had taught them. They were written in blood, learned in seconds that lasted forever. To be a bazooka man was to live on the edge between fear and defiance. But for all its danger, there was pride in it, a quiet, stubborn pride that only those who had carried the weapon could understand. Private DeSanto, the same Brooklyn kid who had seen his first Panzer burn in Tunisia, summed it up best in a letter home. They call me a walking coffin because I carry the rockets. But I'd rather that than sit helpless when a tank comes. At least this way we can fight back. That sentence, simple and raw, captured everything the bazooka had become. It wasn't just a tool of destruction. It was a symbol of defiance. Proof that even in the face of overwhelming power, the will to resist still mattered. And as the war moved north toward Sicily, Italy, and eventually France, that spirit, the spirit of the 2-man team, the idea brotherhood of the stovepipe, would follow. It would guide men through mud, fear, and fire. It would turn despair into determination. Because by then, the bazooka wasn't just a weapon carried on the shoulders of soldiers. It was carried in their hearts.